In the heart of Millbrook, Georgia, the morning sun cast long shadows across the parking lot of Grace Baptist Church. It was March 13, 2011, and the familiar sounds of children's laughter echoed through the hallways as families gathered for their weekly Sunday service. What should have been another peaceful day of worship would instead become the beginning of a mystery that would haunt the community for over a decade. The red brick church had stood as a pillar of the community for nearly 60 years, its white steeple reaching toward the heavens like a beacon of hope. Pastor David Mitchell had served the congregation faithfully for 8 years, and under his leadership, the church had grown to over 300 members. The Sunday school program was particularly vibrant, with children from ages 3 to 17 participating in age-appropriate Bible lessons every week. On this particular Sunday, something felt different. There was an electricity in the air that couldn't quite be explained. The children seemed more restless than usual, and even the adults appeared to be on edge. Perhaps it was the unseasonably warm weather, or maybe it was the anticipation of the upcoming Easter pageant that had everyone stirring with nervous energy. Marcus Johnson, an 8-year-old with an infectious smile and a love for Bible stories, had arrived early with his mother Sarah. He was particularly excited about today's lesson on David and Goliath, having practiced reciting verses all week long. 7-year-old Zoe Williams bounced into the church holding her grandmother's hand, her colorful dress swishing as she walked. She had just lost her first tooth and was eager to show all her friends the gap in her smile. 9-year-old Caleb Thompson, the oldest of the three, carried his well-worn children's Bible under his arm, pages marked with sticky notes from his personal study time. Before we continue, let us know where you're watching from. And don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel by clicking the icon in the bottom right corner of your screen. Now let's get into the story. The morning service proceeded as usual. Pastor Mitchell delivered a powerful sermon about faith and perseverance, his voice resonating through the sanctuary as the congregation hung on every word. The choir, led by Mrs. Dorothy Hayes, filled the church with beautiful harmonies that seemed to lift everyone's spirits. Children fidgeted in their seats, occasionally whispering to each other or drawing pictures on the back of bulletins. At exactly 10:30, as was customary, the children were dismissed to their respective Sunday school classes. Rebecca Foster, a dedicated teacher in her late 20s, gathered her group of 15 children aged 7 to 9. She had been teaching this age group for 3 years and was known for her creative lesson plans and gentle way with the children. Her classroom was located in the church's basement, decorated with colorful Bible verse posters and children's artwork. The lesson that morning focused on courage and trusting in God during difficult times. Rebecca had prepared an interactive activity where the children would act out the story of David facing Goliath. Marcus, Zoe, and Caleb were among the most engaged students, eagerly volunteering to participate in the role-playing exercise. At 11:15, Rebecca announced it was time for their mid-class break. This was a routine part of every Sunday school session, allowing the children to use the restroom, get a drink of water, and stretch their legs before the second half of the lesson. The children filed out of the classroom in typical fashion, some running toward the restrooms, others heading to the water fountain in the hallway. Rebecca remained in the classroom, organizing materials for the craft activity that would conclude their lesson. She had done this same routine hundreds of times before, and there was no reason to expect anything different about this particular Sunday. The basement hallway was well lit and considered completely safe, with multiple adult volunteers positioned throughout the building. 15 minutes passed, then 20. Rebecca began to notice that not all of her students had returned to the classroom. She stepped into the hallway and called out for the stragglers, assuming they were simply taking their time or had gotten distracted by friends from other classes. When there was no response, she walked toward the restrooms to check on them. The hallway was eerily quiet. Other Sunday school classes were already back in session, and the usual sounds of children's voices and activity had resumed throughout the basement. Rebecca checked both restrooms. They were empty. She looked in the small kitchen area where snacks were sometimes prepared nothing. A growing sense of unease began to settle in her stomach. She quickly returned to her classroom and took attendance. 12 children were present. 3 were missing: Marcus Johnson, Zoe Williams, and Caleb Thompson. Rebecca tried to remain calm, thinking perhaps they had wandered upstairs or gotten confused about which classroom to return to. She asked the other children if they had seen their missing classmates, but no one could provide any helpful information. At 11:45, Rebecca made the decision to alert other teachers and volunteers. Within minutes, a systematic search of the entire church building began. Sunday school classes were temporarily suspended as teachers and volunteers combed through every room, closet, and corner of the facility. They checked the sanctuary, the fellowship hall, the kitchen, the offices, and even the storage areas. Thomas Reed, a longtime deacon and member of the church security team, coordinated the search efforts. He was a methodical man who approached everything with military precision, having served 2 tours in Iraq before returning to civilian life. Under his direction, the search expanded to include the church grounds, the surrounding parking lot, and the small wooded area behind the building. By noon, when the main service was concluding, word had spread throughout the congregation that 3 children were missing. Parents began to panic, clutching their own children closer and demanding answers that no one could provide. The atmosphere in the church shifted from one of peaceful worship to one of fear and confusion. Pastor Mitchell made the difficult decision to address the entire congregation. Standing at the pulpit, his usually steady voice trembled slightly as he explained the situation and asked for everyone's prayers and assistance. He assured the families that everything possible was being done to locate the missing children, but his words provided little comfort to the growing crowd of worried parents and community members. Sarah Johnson, Marcus's mother, was among the first to arrive when the news reached the main sanctuary. Her face went pale as the reality of the situation hit her. She had trusted this church, these people, with her son's safety. How could 3 children simply vanish from what should have been the safest place in their community? Chapter 2. The search begins. The Millbrook Police Department received the call at 12:17 p.m. Detective James Crawford was enjoying a rare quiet Sunday afternoon with his family when his phone buzzed with the emergency notification. As the lead detective for the county's missing persons unit, he knew that time was critical in cases involving children. He kissed his wife goodbye and headed immediately to Grace Baptist Church. By the time Detective Crawford arrived, the church parking lot had transformed into a scene of controlled chaos. Police cruisers lined the street, their red and blue lights flashing against the afternoon sun. Parents stood in clusters, some crying, others pacing nervously while clutching their own children. Local news vans had already begun to arrive, their satellite dishes extending toward the sky like mechanical prayers. Crawford was a seasoned investigator with 15 years of experience, but missing children cases always affected him deeply. He had 2 daughters of his own, ages 6 and 10, and he couldn't imagine the terror that the families were experiencing. He approached the scene with the methodical precision that had made him successful in his career, but his heart ached for the parents who were living every family's worst nightmare. Pastor Mitchell met Crawford at the front entrance of the church, his face etched with worry and disbelief. The 2 men had met before at various community events, and Crawford knew the pastor to be a man of integrity and genuine care for his congregation. As they walked through the building, Pastor Mitchell explained the timeline of events and introduced Crawford to the key individuals involved. Rebecca Foster was interviewed first. She sat in Pastor Mitchell's office, her hands shaking as she recounted the morning's events in detail. Crawford listened carefully, taking notes and asking clarifying questions. Rebecca's account was consistent and detailed. She had followed the same routine she had used for 3 years without incident. There was nothing unusual about the children's behavior or the circumstances leading up to their disappearance. The basement classroom where the children had last been seen became the focal point of the investigation. Crawford examined every inch of the space, looking for any clues that might indicate what had happened. The room was neat and organized, with no signs of struggle or disturbance. Children's crafts and Bible lesson materials were still laid out on the tables, waiting for students who would never return. The church's security system was limited but functional. Several cameras monitored the main entrances and the parking lot, but unfortunately, none were positioned in the basement hallway where the children had last been seen. Crawford reviewed the available footage, watching as families arrived for service and noting the normal flow of activity throughout the morning. The footage showed Marcus, Zoe, and Caleb entering the church with their families at various times between 9:30 and 10 a.m. All three children appeared happy and excited, interacting normally with other kids and adults. The cameras captured them walking toward the basement for Sunday school at 10:30, but there was no footage of them leaving the building. Thomas Reed provided Crawford with a detailed layout of the church and its grounds. The building had multiple exits, including several that led directly outside from the basement level. However, all of these exits were typically locked during services and required a key or interior release to open. Reed checked each exit and confirmed that they were all still locked and showed no signs of tampering. The search expanded beyond the church building as volunteer teams began combing through the surrounding area. Millbrook was a small town of approximately 8,000 residents, surrounded by farmland and patches of wooded areas. The Chattahoochee River ran along the eastern edge of town, adding another element of concern to the search efforts. Local businesses were contacted and asked to review their security footage for any signs of the missing children. The Millbrook Elementary School, where all three children were students, was searched thoroughly despite being closed for the weekend. Community members organized search parties, walking through neighborhoods and checking abandoned buildings, while others prepared food and drinks for the searchers and families. As evening approached, the Georgia Bureau of Investigation was called in to assist with the case. The FBI was also notified, as cases involving missing children often required federal resources and expertise. The quiet Sunday afternoon had evolved into a full-scale law enforcement operation, with investigators from multiple agencies working together to find Marcus, Zoe, and Caleb. Sarah Johnson, Zoe's grandmother Margaret Williams, and Caleb's parents, Robert and Lisa Thompson, maintained a vigil at the church throughout the day. They were surrounded by friends and fellow congregation members who provided emotional support and helped coordinate communication with extended family members. The three families had known each other for years through the church, and their children had been friends since they were toddlers. The local media coverage intensified as the day progressed. The story of three young children disappearing from a church during Sunday school captured regional attention and began to spread through social media networks. Amber alerts were issued across Georgia and neighboring states, with photos and descriptions of Marcus, Zoe, and Caleb broadcast on television and radio stations. Community leaders, including the mayor and city council members, arrived at the church to show support and coordinate additional resources. The Red Cross set up a temporary shelter in the church fellowship hall to provide food and comfort for the families and volunteers. Local businesses donated supplies, and restaurants provided meals for the hundreds of people involved in the search efforts. As darkness fell on Millbrook, search teams equipped with flashlights and portable spotlights continued their efforts. The Georgia State Patrol coordinated roadblocks on major highways leading out of the area, checking vehicles and distributing flyers with the children's photos. Helicopters with thermal imaging equipment were requested to search the wooded areas and farmland surrounding the town. Detective Crawford worked late into the night, interviewing church members and volunteers who had been present that morning. Each person provided consistent accounts of a normal Sunday morning that had suddenly turned tragic. No one had seen anything suspicious or unusual. No strangers had been noticed in or around the church. There were no signs of forced entry or evidence of a struggle. The investigation revealed that all three missing children came from stable, loving families with no history of domestic issues or problems that might suggest a reason for them to run away. Marcus was described as a responsible and obedient child who loved school and church activities. Zoe was known for her cheerful personality and close relationship with her grandmother. Caleb was an excellent student who enjoyed reading and was actively involved in the church's youth programs. By midnight, over 200 people were involved in the search efforts, but there was still no trace of the 3 missing children. The families maintained their vigil, praying together and clinging to hope that their children would be found safe and unharmed. The investigation would continue around the clock, but the first crucial 24 hours were slipping away without any significant leads or discoveries. Chapter 3: Growing Desperation. The second day of the search began before dawn, with teams of volunteers and law enforcement officers resuming their systematic sweep of the area surrounding Grace Baptist Church. The initial shock of the disappearance had given way to a grim determination among the searchers, though privately, many were beginning to fear the worst. Detective Crawford had managed only 3 hours of sleep before returning to coordinate the expanded investigation. The FBI had arrived during the night, bringing additional resources and expertise in child abduction cases. Special Agent Patricia Williams, a veteran investigator with the Bureau's Crimes Against Children unit, took charge of the federal aspects of the case while working closely with local authorities. Agent Williams brought a different perspective to the investigation. Her experience with similar cases had taught her that child abductions from public places, particularly religious institutions, often involved someone known to the victims or the community. She began developing a comprehensive background check on every adult who had been present at the church that Sunday morning. The investigation revealed that 47 adults had been in the building during the time the children disappeared. This included church staff, Sunday school teachers, volunteers, and parents who had remained for various activities. Each person was interviewed multiple times, their movements tracked and verified through witness statements and available security footage. Rebecca Foster underwent extensive questioning about her teaching methods, her relationship with the children, and her knowledge of the church's layout and security procedures. Despite her obvious distress and cooperation, investigators had to consider the possibility that someone with direct access to the children might be involved. Her background check revealed nothing suspicious. She was a longtime member of the church with no criminal history or concerning associations. Thomas Reed, due to his role in church security and his military background, also received intensive scrutiny. His access to all areas of the building and his knowledge of security protocols made him a person of interest, though he had been visible to multiple witnesses throughout the morning and had led much of the initial search effort. The church's financial records were examined for any signs of financial stress or irregularities that might suggest a motive for the disappearance. Pastor Mitchell voluntarily provided access to all church documents and accounts, which were found to be in good order with no indication of mismanagement or financial difficulties. As the investigation expanded, disturbing patterns began to emerge in the community's history. Millbrook, like many small southern towns, had a complex racial history that some residents preferred not to discuss. The fact that all 3 missing children were African American in a predominantly white community raised questions that investigators could not ignore. Agent Williams discovered that there had been racial tensions in Millbrook as recently as 5 years earlier, when the city council had debated removing the Confederate monument from the town square. The debate had divided the community, with some residents forming informal groups to oppose the monument's removal. While the monument had ultimately remained, the controversy had created lasting divisions in the town. Further investigation revealed that Grace Baptist Church itself had only been integrated in 1987, much later than many other institutions in the area. Some older congregation members had initially opposed the integration, though by 2011, the church appeared to be genuinely welcoming to families of all backgrounds. The 3 missing children's families had been active members for several years, without any reported incidents of discrimination or hostility. Detective Crawford began exploring the possibility that the children's disappearance might be connected to racial motivations, though he was careful not to jump to conclusions. He interviewed longtime residents about the town's history and any individuals or groups that might harbor racist sentiments strong enough to commit such a heinous act. The search efforts expanded to include abandoned buildings and properties throughout the county. Rural Georgia contained numerous old farmhouses, barns, and industrial buildings that could potentially be used to hide kidnapped children. Each location was methodically searched by teams equipped with specialized equipment to detect signs of recent human presence. Search and rescue dogs were brought in from Atlanta and other major cities to assist in the effort. The highly trained animals worked tirelessly, following scent trails and searching areas that human searchers might miss. However, the dogs were unable to establish a clear trail leading away from the church, suggesting that the children might have been transported in a vehicle shortly after their disappearance. The families of the missing children began to show signs of the enormous stress they were under. Sarah Johnson had barely eaten or slept since her son's disappearance, and friends worried about her physical and mental health. Margaret Williams, Zoe's grandmother, suffered from diabetes and hypertension, conditions that were exacerbated by the trauma of her granddaughter's disappearance. Robert and Lisa Thompson tried to maintain strength for each other and their younger daughter, but the strain was evident in their drawn faces and hollow eyes. The three families supported each other through their shared grief and fear, spending most of their time together at the church or at each other's homes, afraid to be alone with their thoughts. The media attention continued to intensify, with national news outlets picking up the story. The image of three young children disappearing from a church during Sunday school resonated with parents across the country, generating widespread sympathy and offers of assistance. However, the increased attention also brought unwanted complications, including false leads, conspiracy theories, and opportunistic individuals seeking to exploit the tragedy. Social media platforms were flooded with posts about the case, many containing inaccurate information or harmful speculation. Rumors began to circulate about everything from human trafficking rings to cult activities, creating additional stress for the families and investigators. Law enforcement had to dedicate resources to investigating these false leads while trying to maintain focus on legitimate aspects of the case. Local churches organized prayer vigils and fundraising efforts to support the families and the search operations. The interfaith community came together in a way that many had never seen before, with Baptist, Methodist, Presbyterian, and even Catholic congregations joining forces to provide practical and spiritual support. The psychological impact on the broader community was significant. Parents became reluctant to let their children out of their sight, and church attendance in the area declined as families struggled with questions about safety and faith. Some people expressed anger at God for allowing such a tragedy to occur, while others turned to prayer and religious activities as a source of comfort. Schools in the area implemented additional security measures and provided counseling services for students who knew the missing children. Marcus, Zoe, and Caleb had been popular students who were well liked by their classmates and teachers. Their empty desks served as daily reminders of the tragedy that had befallen their community. As the first week of the investigation concluded, law enforcement officials were forced to admit that they had no solid leads or suspects. The case was beginning to take on the characteristics of a cold case, though investigators were reluctant to acknowledge this possibility publicly. The families continued to hold on to hope, but the reality of their situation was becoming increasingly difficult to deny. Chapter 4: The Cold Case Years. 2 months after the disappearance, the intensive daily search operations were scaled back, though the investigation remained active. Detective Crawford continued to follow up on leads and tips that came in from across the country, but the quality and quantity of useful information had decreased significantly. The case had captured national attention briefly, but public interest inevitably moved on to other stories. The families of Marcus, Zoe, and Caleb faced the agonizing reality of learning to live with uncertainty. Sarah Johnson took a leave of absence from her job at the local bank, unable to concentrate on work while her son remained missing. She spent her days maintaining a detailed journal of the investigation, following up on tips, and advocating for continued law enforcement attention to the case. Margaret Williams aged visibly in the months following Zoe's disappearance. Her health declined as she struggled with the loss of her granddaughter, whom she had helped raise since birth. She became a fixture at the local police station, calling Detective Crawford daily and pleading for updates on the investigation. The Thompson family made the difficult decision to leave Millbrook 18 months after Caleb's disappearance. The constant reminders of their missing son and the lack of progress in the case had become unbearable. They moved to North Carolina, where Robert had been offered a job transfer, but they maintained contact with investigators and returned to Georgia whenever there were developments in the case. Grace Baptist Church struggled to heal from the trauma of the disappearance. Attendance dropped by nearly 30% in the year following the incident, as families either moved away or found other places of worship. Pastor Mitchell considered resigning, feeling somehow responsible for the tragedy that had occurred under his leadership, but the remaining congregation urged him to stay. The church implemented comprehensive security upgrades, including additional cameras throughout the building and new protocols for supervising children during all activities. The basement classroom where the children had last been seen was converted into a storage room, as no one felt comfortable using it for Sunday school classes. Rebecca Foster eventually left her teaching position and moved to Alabama to live with relatives. The guilt and trauma of losing the children under her care had become overwhelming. Despite counseling and support from the church community, she never stopped blaming herself for not watching the children more carefully during their break time. Detective Crawford refused to let the case go cold, even as his supervisors assigned him to other investigations. He worked on the case during his off hours, reviewing evidence and following up on new leads. His dedication to finding the missing children put strain on his marriage and family life, but he felt a personal responsibility to the families and the community. The investigation took several different directions over the years. Investigators explored the possibility that the children had been taken by a human trafficking organization, though there was no evidence to support this theory. They examined potential connections to other missing children cases in the Southeast, but found no clear patterns or links. One lead that generated significant attention involved a reported sighting of the 3 children at a truck stop in Tennessee 6 months after their disappearance. A witness claimed to have seen children, matching their descriptions with an adult male who appeared to be keeping them under close watch. However, extensive investigation revealed that the witness had been mistaken, and security footage from the truck stop did not corroborate the sighting. The racial motivation angle was thoroughly investigated, with FBI agents interviewing members of known hate groups in the region. Several individuals were polygraphed and had their alibis verified, but no credible suspects emerged from this line of inquiry. While racial tensions existed in the community, investigators could not establish a clear connection to the children's disappearance. A particularly painful development occurred 3 years after the disappearance, when human remains were discovered in a wooded area about 50 miles from Millbrook. The families endured agonizing weeks waiting for DNA results, only to learn that the remains belonged to an adult victim of an unrelated crime. Each false lead brought renewed hope, followed by crushing disappointment. The case was featured on several national television programs, including America's Most Wanted and Unsolved Mysteries. These programs generated hundreds of tips and potential leads, but none resulted in significant breakthroughs. The exposure did help keep the case in the public consciousness and demonstrated that people across the country had not forgotten about Marcus, Zoe, and Caleb. Advances in forensic technology provided new opportunities to examine evidence from the church. DNA analysis was performed on various items from the Sunday school classroom, but the results only confirmed what investigators already knew. The children had been in the room that morning. No foreign DNA or unusual traces were discovered that might point to an abductor. The financial cost of the investigation reached into the hundreds of thousands of dollars, straining the budgets of local law enforcement agencies. Federal assistance helped cover some expenses, but the ongoing costs of following leads and maintaining the investigation became a significant burden for the small town of Millbrook. Community support for the families remained strong, though it evolved over time. Annual memorial services were held at Grace Baptist Church, and a scholarship fund was established in the children's names to help other local students pursue their education. The playground at Millbrook Elementary School was dedicated to Marcus, Zoe, and Caleb, serving as a permanent reminder of the children who had touched so many lives. Private investigators were hired by the families at various times, using money raised through community fundraising efforts. These investigators brought fresh perspectives and resources to the case, but they were ultimately unable to uncover information that had eluded law enforcement professionals. The psychological toll on the community was long-lasting. Trust in institutions, particularly churches and schools, was shaken. Parents became more protective of their children, and the innocent sense of security that had characterized small-town life in Millbrook was permanently altered. By 2018, 7 years after the disappearance, the case had essentially become dormant. Detective Crawford had retired, though he continued to think about the missing children daily. New investigators had taken over the case files, but with no new leads or evidence, there was little active investigation taking place. The families had learned to cope with their loss while never giving up hope that their children might someday be found. They marked birthdays and holidays with private ceremonies, wondering what their children would look like now and what they might be doing if they were still alive. Sarah Johnson had remarried and had another child, but she kept Marcus's room exactly as it had been the day he disappeared. Margaret Williams had passed away from complications related to her diabetes, taking her memories of Zoe to the grave. The Thompson family had established new lives in North Carolina, but returned to Georgia every year on the anniversary of Caleb's disappearance. The case had become a defining moment in Millbrook's history, a tragedy that marked the end of the town's innocence and the beginning of a more complicated relationship with faith, community, and safety. The questions that had haunted residents for years remained unanswered. What had happened to the 3 children? Who was responsible? And would the truth ever be revealed? Chapter 5: The Revelation. 12 years had passed since that devastating Sunday morning when 3 innocent children vanished from Grace Baptist Church. The town of Millbrook had learned to live with the unanswered questions, though the pain never truly faded. Then, in March of 2023, an unexpected discovery would finally shed light on the mystery that had haunted the community for over a decade. The revelation came from an unlikely source. Patricia Daniels, a member of Grace Baptist Church who had moved to Florida shortly after the disappearance, was cleaning out her late mother's house when she made a startling discovery. Hidden in a dusty cardboard box in the basement, beneath old photo albums and church bulletins, she found an ancient handheld video camera that her mother had forgotten about. Patricia's mother, Eleanor Daniels, had been an enthusiastic documenter of church events and family gatherings. She had used the small digital camera throughout the late 2000s and early 2010s before switching to smartphone photography. The camera had been tucked away and forgotten after Eleanor developed dementia in 2015. Curious about what memories might be stored on the device, Patricia charged the old camera and began reviewing the footage. Most of the videos showed typical church activities, choir performances, potluck dinners, and holiday celebrations. But one video, recorded on March 13, 2011, would change everything. Eleanor had been filming the children's Sunday school program that morning, intending to create a compilation video for the families. The timestamp showed that she had begun recording at 11:20 a.m., just 5 minutes after the children had been dismissed for their break. Her camera had captured something that no one had noticed in the chaos following the disappearance. The video showed the basement hallway from an elevated angle, as Eleanor had positioned herself at the top of the stairs to get a better view. In the background, barely visible in the lower right corner of the frame, 3 small figures could be seen walking toward what appeared to be a maintenance door that led to the church's old coal cellar. Patricia gasped as she recognized the distinctive clothing worn by Marcus, Zoe, and Caleb that morning. The video showed the children following an adult figure whose face was not clearly visible from the camera's angle. The adult appeared to be leading them toward the maintenance area, which was located in the oldest section of the church's basement. The coal cellar had been part of the original church building from the 1950s, before the building was converted to modern heating systems. It had been sealed off decades earlier and was not part of the systematic search conducted in 2011. The entrance was hidden behind old furniture and storage boxes, and most current church members didn't even know of its existence. Patricia immediately contacted Detective Crawford, who had remained in touch with the families despite his retirement. Crawford, now in his early 60s, felt his heart racing as he watched the video footage. After 12 years of dead ends and false leads, here was actual evidence showing what had happened to the missing children. The current detective assigned to the case, Detective Maria Santos, was contacted immediately. Within hours, a team of investigators was en route to Grace Baptist Church with specialized equipment to access the sealed coal cellar. The families of the missing children were notified, and they rushed back to Millbrook from their various locations. The process of accessing the coal cellar was painstaking and emotional. Heavy furniture and decades of stored materials had to be carefully moved to reach the sealed entrance. Church members who had been present 12 years earlier gathered to watch as investigators worked to uncover the truth that had been hidden for so long. When the cellar was finally opened, investigators found evidence that confirmed their worst fears. The small underground space contained the remains of Marcus, Zoe, and Caleb, along with clear evidence that they had been trapped there. The children appeared to have succumbed to asphyxiation, likely within hours of being led into the sealed space. The investigation quickly focused on identifying the adult figure seen in the video. Enhanced digital analysis of the footage revealed enough detail to determine that the person was likely Thomas Reed, the church deacon who had led the initial search efforts 12 years earlier. The irony was devastating. The man who had coordinated the search for the missing children had been the one responsible for their disappearance. Thomas Reed had died 5 years earlier from a heart attack, taking his secrets to the grave. However, investigators were able to piece together a disturbing picture of what had likely occurred. Reed had been experiencing severe financial difficulties in 2011 due to gambling debts, and there was evidence suggesting he may have intended to demand ransom money from the families. The investigation revealed that Reed had been familiar with the coal cellar from his years serving on the church maintenance committee. It appeared that he had lured the children to the area under some pretense, possibly telling them he needed help with a church project. The cellar door had an old-fashioned latch that could only be opened from the outside, effectively trapping anyone inside. Investigators theorized that Reed's plan had gone wrong when he was unable to follow through with ransom demands due to the immediate and intensive search efforts. He may have panicked and decided to leave the children in the cellar, possibly intending to return later but finding himself unable to do so without arousing suspicion. The tragic irony that Reed had led the search efforts, while knowing exactly where the children were located, was almost too painful for the families and community to comprehend. He had stood in the church sanctuary that first day, coordinating search teams and offering comfort to the frantic parents, all while knowing that their children were trapped just feet below. The discovery brought a mixture of relief and renewed grief to the families. Sarah Johnson, now in her 40s, finally had answers to the questions that had tormented her for 12 years. "I always wondered if Marcus was out there somewhere, if he was being hurt, or if he was trying to find his way home," she said through tears. "At least now I know he's at peace." Margaret Williams had passed away years earlier without ever knowing what happened to her granddaughter. But Zoe's mother, who had been estranged from the family, returned to Millbrook for the first time since the disappearance. The Thompson family traveled from North Carolina to finally lay their son to rest. The revelation sent shockwaves through what remained of Grace Baptist Church's congregation. Many members felt betrayed and angry that someone they had trusted and respected had been capable of such a horrific act. The church, which had already been struggling with declining membership, faced questions about whether it could continue to serve the community. Pastor Mitchell, now in his 70s, announced his retirement shortly after the discovery. He had carried the burden of the unsolved disappearance throughout his final years of ministry, and learning the truth was both a relief and a source of profound sadness. "I should have known," he said. "I should have seen the signs. These children were entrusted to our care, and we failed them." The community held a memorial service for Marcus, Zoe, and Caleb at the Millbrook High School Gymnasium, as the church was considered too small and too painful a location for such a gathering. Hundreds of people attended, including law enforcement officers, church members, and residents who had participated in the search efforts 12 years earlier. The three children were finally laid to rest in a ceremony that brought closure to a community that had lived with uncertainty for over a decade. Their graves were placed side by side in Millbrook Cemetery, with headstones that celebrated their young lives and the joy they had brought to everyone who knew them. The case served as a sobering reminder that evil can exist in the most unexpected places, and that trust can be betrayed by those who appear most trustworthy. It also highlighted the importance of thorough investigations and the value of never giving up hope that the truth will eventually be revealed. Grace Baptist Church was eventually sold and converted into a community center, as the congregation could no longer bear the weight of worshiping in a place where such tragedy had occurred. The coal cellar was permanently sealed and a memorial garden was planted above it, ensuring that Marcus, Zoe, and Caleb would never be forgotten. The story of their disappearance and the eventual discovery of the truth became a catalyst for improved safety protocols in churches and schools throughout the region. Background checks became more thorough, and supervision of children was enhanced to prevent similar tragedies from occurring. For the families, the revelation brought an end to 12 years of not knowing, but it also marked the beginning of a new phase of grief and healing. They had finally received the answers they had sought for so long, but those answers came with the painful knowledge that their children had died alone and afraid, just steps away from the very people who were searching for them. The truth had finally been revealed, but it was a truth that no one had wanted to discover. The children of Grace Baptist Church had not been taken by strangers or lost in the woods. They had been betrayed by someone they trusted, someone who had smiled at them every Sunday and pretended to care about their welfare while harboring darkness in his heart. As the community of Millbrook worked to heal from this final revelation, they carried with them the memory of three beautiful children whose lives had been cut tragically short, and whose disappearance had forever changed the way they understood trust, faith, and the capacity for both good and evil that exists within the human heart.